Welcome to the Holiday Inn Express, which is right next door to the Aberdeen Exhibition and Conference Centre, which is hosting the largest ever SNP conference. The hotel bar behind me, as you can hear, is starting to fill up with the thousands of party members who are in town. They're relaxing over a couple of drinks, kicking back after a hard day at the conference. No rest for the wicked though. STV's Holyrood editor, Colin Mackay, joins me now. Colin, you've been at loads of these conferences. Can you just sum up the mood for me today?
It's definitely the biggest and the busiest, and they're buzzing. They are up for next year's election. They've been told that they've got to deliver another 10 years now for the First Minister. They're ready for that.
We'll be hearing from the First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, in just a few moments. But first, here's Scotland Tonight's James Chain.
It's an arena more suited to rock stars than politicians. Status Quo are playing here in a few weeks' time. But the SNP say it's one of only 2 venues in Scotland that can cope with their new numbers. Their leader has addressed crowds this size before, of course. This morning, Nicola Sturgeon gave them a warm welcome and then addressed the issue that's brought so many new members into the party.
Friends, I believe with all my heart that Scotland should be an independent country. But I, of course, respect the decision that our country made last year. So let me be clear. To propose another referendum in the next Parliament without strong evidence that a significant number of those who voted no have changed their minds would be wrong, and we won't do that. It would not be respecting the decision that people made.
It won her a big round of applause, but not everyone's on the same page. Debating a second independence referendum might be firmly off the conference agenda, but it's firmly on the minds of many of these activists, and so Nicola Sturgeon appeared to dampen expectations from the very beginning. The First Minister outlined certain triggers that could bring one about: a vote to leave the EU, for example, renewal of Trident, or continued austerity. Of course, she'd need public opinion to move in her favour as well. Whether you're a critic or a fan, though, everyone's aware the SNP is a much bigger political player than it was in previous generations. This was the entire party conference in 1956. They can't fit onto a few front steps anymore. They need their Rockstar Arena instead.
Well, after her address to the conference, I sat down with the First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon. Nicola Sturgeon, thanks very much indeed for joining us on Scotland Tonight. You've said in your speech this morning that to propose another referendum in the next Parliament without strong evidence that a significant number of those who voted no have changed their minds would be wrong, and we won't do it. This makes a second independence referendum in the next 5 years highly unlikely.
I've not ruled it out, because what I went on to say is if there is significant evidence that people have changed their minds, then it would be wrong to rule it out. What I'm effectively saying is that it's down to public opinion. So if people don't change their minds from last year, it would be wrong to have another referendum, because that wouldn't be respecting the outcome of last year. But if people do change their minds, and there's many reasons why people might, you know, the Tory approach to austerity, the renewal of Trident, a European referendum that might take us out of Europe against our will. If we see support for independence continue to rise, and I think we might, then it would be wrong equally to rule that out. So what I've said is the decision will be rooted in the principles of respect for the result last year, but also democracy, because in any democracy, people have the right to change their minds.
Well, you do say if there's strong and consistent evidence that, you know, if people change their minds, you would have a second independence referendum. But how do you measure that?
Well, I think we'd have to see over, you know, a significant period of time, you know, in opinion polls, as one example, of a change in opinion from last year, so that independence had become the preference of a majority of people in Scotland. I'm not talking about one poll or 2 polls, I'm talking about a shift of opinion over a reasonable time period.
And what kind of figures are we talking about here?
Well,
55%, 60%?
I'm not going to put figures on it. I think we'll know if opinion has shifted so that a majority of people now support independence. And if we get to that position, and I think we will at some point in the future, because I think Scotland will become independent, then it would be wrong for any politician to try to stand in the way of democracy in those circumstances.
How likely do you think it will be that an EU referendum would trigger a second independence referendum?
Very likely. I don't think it's absolutely automatic, but I think it is highly likely. And, you know, I said in my speech today, I almost think the issue of the European Union right now has to be looked at on its own merits. I mean, if you remember the referendum campaign last year, the No campaign said the only way to guarantee our membership of Europe was to vote no. I mean, it was nonsense, but that was a central part of their campaign. So now, if Scotland was to find itself taken out of Europe, even although we had voted to stay in, that would almost breach the terms of the result last year. And I think in those circumstances, demand for a second referendum could be unstoppable. So I think David Cameron has to have that very much in his mind as he negotiates the European issue.
Let's look ahead to the elections. You say you're proud of your record in government. Why is there still such an educational attainment gap in Scotland?
The attainment gap is narrowing. So, you know, if you look, for example, at university applications, since 2006, there's been a 50% increase in young people from our most deprived areas applying to go to university. If you look at our higher exam results, you will see the attainment gap narrowing over the time the SNP has been in government. But, you know, I'm not the kind of politician or the kind of person that is happy to rest on laurels and say we've had some improvement, so that's good enough. Particularly on an issue as important as education, I want to see us go further and faster. I've said, politicians don't often do this. Judge me on this if we're re-elected over the next Parliament, because it's that important to me.
Well, you say, yes, judge me in 5 years' time, but you've been in power since 2007.
And the attainment gap has narrowed. More young people from our deprived areas are going to university. So what I'm saying is, our record is one I'm proud of because we've made progress, but I want to see us make more progress, because at the end of the day, ambition for this country and for everybody who lives here is the hallmark of the government I lead.
The Scottish Government will have control over income tax by 2017. What's the SNP planning to do with that power?
Well, we'll take decisions on income tax in our budgets on a year-to-year basis, as all sensible governments do, and we'll base those decisions firstly on the prevailing economic circumstances of the time, but also on what it is we're trying to achieve as a government, which is to grow our economy and make our society fairer.
But Labour's pledged to raise the top level of income tax. Would you be comfortable with Labour being to the left of you on this issue?
Oh, I don't think Labour knows where it is on the political spectrum, left, right, or going round in circles at the moment.
But they have pledged to raise the top level.
Well, actually, if you go back a few years when the SNP voted for that in the House of Commons, Labour voted against it because they didn't want to vote with the SNP. It was in our general election manifesto. The point I'm making is, you know, next year in April, we get some limited income tax powers, but they are inflexible. So if you were to put the top rate of tax up by 5p, you'd also have to put the basic rate up by 5p. Now, I don't think anybody would advocate that position. The year after that, assuming it goes according to plan, we'll have more flexibility around that. What I'm saying is we will take decisions at that time based on what we deem to be the right thing to do for the country. All of the decisions we've taken have been driven by our progressive principles, and that will continue to be the case in the future.
Westminster is giving you the power to top up welfare benefits.
Well, we don't actually, with the greatest respect, we don't know what Westminster are proposing on that right now, because we've had a vague commitment from the Secretary of State for Scotland, but we've, as things stand right now, seen nothing.
But they've said in time that you will have the power to top up welfare benefits. Would you do that if you were given that power?
We'll use whatever powers we've got, and I've got to wait and see what the extent of those powers is going to be before I can answer the question how we will use them.
Would you do that to mitigate the effects of the cuts in tax credits?
Anybody who knows what the SNP government is doing now knows the answer to that question is yes. We will always seek to use whatever powers we've got to mitigate where we can what the UK government is doing. So right now, we're spending £104 million a year mitigating Tory welfare cuts, including spending money to make sure not a single person in Scotland has to pay the bedroom tax.
Okay.